This following sourdough starter maintenance has helped me bake sourdough breads with the best texture and taste. Just take a look at these two breads that I made based on the same recipe. The only difference is the way I maintained the starters. The short and dry one on the right was leavened by sourdough starter that I maintained using the method that I covered in previous video. Meanwhile, the one on the left, which looks and tastes better, was leavened using sourdough starter that I maintained based on the method that I am going to share with you. To do this sourdough starter maintenance, you don't need much starter. This is only about 10 grams of sourdough starter that I am going to feed at 1 to 5 to 5 ratio. The reason why I use this higher ratio, not the regular 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, is because I want to reduce the acidity or the acid load from the starter. That way, the new starter is less acidic. When the starter is too acidic, it will compromise the gluten development when we knead bread dough. You will end up with shorter and drier bread, like I showed you earlier. I keep the liquid starter at 100% hydration, which means it contains 1 part flour and 1 part water. To maintain the level of hydration, I add 50 grams bread flour and 50 grams water to my 10 gram sourdough starter. For the flour, I use bread flour with 13% protein content, and the water I use filtered well water. I stir the 3 ingredients, the starter, bread flour, and water until there is no dry flour remaining. To get a starter that can rise taller or higher, I will perform foldings, which are similar to kneading bread dough. The goal is to build gluten network in the starter so the dough can trap the gas produced during the fermentation a lot better. After I'm done stirring the new starter, I will let it rest for 20 to 30 minutes before I do the foldings. If you wonder why I don't just knead the starter dough, it's because this starter is quite wet. It's nearly impossible to knead it. Therefore, I do foldings instead. These foldings do not only help the starter rise taller, but also promote the growth of the microbes that need oxygen, because when you do foldings, you add more oxygen to the dough. Sometimes when I do not have time, I skip the folding step. I just stir starter, flour, and water and then cover it and then let it ferment. Although for most of the time, I try my best to perform the foldings, because when I do, my starter rises taller, at least 3 times its initial height, and the air bubbles are larger. So this is my starter. After I stir the 3 ingredients, I let it sit at room temperature, covered for 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will do the foldings. This time I will use spatula to do the foldings. First, I dip the spatula in the water, that way the starter dough will not stick too much to the spatula. And to perform foldings, you just lift the edges of the dough and then fold them toward the center until you get smoother dough. If this is not your first time in sourdough baking, you probably have heard about stretch and fold. But to those who are new in sourdough baking, stretch and fold is just simply what I'm doing here. There is stretching or lifting the dough and then folding it toward the center. When you do foldings, you encourage the gluten strands to form a strong and cohesive network, which translates into smooth and elastic dough. I'm done doing the foldings, and now I cover the starter dough and let it rest for another 20 to 30 minutes. So usually I do 2 sets of foldings, but if you are pressed on time, you can just do 1 set of foldings or skip it altogether. Instead of stretch and fold, for the second set of foldings, I will perform coil fold using my hands. After dipping my hands in the water, I lift 2 sides of the dough and then fold it. I do the foldings on all 4 sides of the dough. You can do either stretch and fold or coil fold, whichever that feels more comfortable to you. After you're done, put the new starter dough inside a fermentation vessel, which is better if it's clear and straight-sided. That way you can monitor the growth of the starter easily. Then put the lid on the container. Although the container doesn't need to be airtight, just covered enough to minimize airflow, that way the starter doesn't dry out. Next, let the starter ferment at cooler temperature between 18 to 21 degrees Celsius or 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is to make sure that the fermentation takes place slowly, that way the starter doesn't get hungry too quickly, and also to balance the microbial activities in it. If the temperature is too high or too low, more acids will be produced, and too much acid will cripple the wild yeast. And the starter, of course, will not be able to leaven bread dough properly. After 10 to 12 hours of fermentation, the starter should rise to its maximum height or peak position. Mine reaches about 4 times its initial height. At this point, the starter can be used to build bread dough, or if you don't want to use it, you can repeat the feeding steps. So basically with this method, I do the feeding twice a day at 1 to 5 to 5 ratio, and do the fermentation at cooler temperature between 18 to 21 degrees Celsius or 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. When I do not plan to use the starter for building bread dough, I only use a very small amount of starter to feed. Most of the time I only use 4 to 5 grams starter. By doing so, I minimize the leftover starter or sourdough discard while keeping the starter at its best shape. With this method, the starter doesn't go into the refrigerator. It stays at ambient temperature, which ideally should stay between 16 to 30 degrees Celsius or 60 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. No more or no less. That way we can have a balance between wild yeast and bacterial activities. Keeping the starter at ambient temperature and feeding it twice a day will make it more stable, and in return it's easier to get more consistent and better sourdough breads. To some people, this might sound too much of a hassle to feed sourdough starter twice a day, but for those who want to improve their sourdough baking experience and the quality of their sourdough breads, I can't recommend it enough. For many years, I was frustrated because my sourdough breads were all over the place. from one batch to the next one could be very, very different in terms of flavor and texture. But once I changed the way I maintain my starter, my sourdough breads have been turning out consistently good. However, I completely understand that this method is not for everyone. For those who want hassle-free sourdough maintenance, go ahead check on my previous video where I talk about how you can maintain sourdough starter without involving daily feeding and sourdough discard. I'll put the link to the video in the description below. For the second feeding of the day, I also do foldings, but like I have said, these foldings are optional. The frequency of the feedings itself is more important in keeping your starter healthy. When you do foldings, you can do as many folds as you need until you have smooth dough. You can do stretch and fold or coil fold. In this one, I do coil fold, but earlier I also did stretch and fold using spatula. You also can choose to do one set or two sets of foldings. For the timing, I usually do the feedings around 8 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening, but the schedule can be flexible between 10 to 14-hour intervals. If it's impossible to do two feedings in one day, you can do at least one feeding. Do it at higher ratio, maybe 1 to 10 to 10. So for example, 4 grams starter, 40 grams bread flour, and 40 grams water. Always keep your starter at ambient temperature or room temperature and pay attention to this temperature because it does not only affect the speed of fermentation but also the quality of the starter and in the end the quality of your sourdough breads.